first thing I want to say is this regarding Peter being uneducated and not able to write Greek. There are several problems with this idea. And this idea is usually put forward by New Testament scholars like 𝙎𝙪𝙗𝙗, who honestly see it as their mission in life to try and discredit the New Testament and deconstruct students' faith as often as they can. And 𝙎𝙪𝙗𝙗, I'm not making this up about him. He talks about this. He takes pleasure in having first-year college students come take his courses and having their entire Christian worldview torn down and wrecked. He teaches right up the street from where I am at UNC Chapel Hill. And he's one of the people that says, Peter and the disciples never would have spoken Greek. They were uneducated. They were Galilean fishermen. Well, funny thing about that is Greek was the lingua franca of the known world by the 1st century. Okay. And I actually talk all about this in a video that I did a couple years ago on the intertestamental period. And I linked that video in the show notes below. And I actually linked the remastered version because we republished it just a couple of months ago. And I get into how Greek had become the lingua franca of the known world. By the time Jesus was born, it was the first time in world history that almost anywhere you went, from Northern Africa all the way up to as far as Northern Europe today, most people spoke Greek, or at least understood Greek, or could communicate in some way in Greek. I mean, come on. Roman soldiers who were stationed all over the world, they weren't speaking Latin, they were speaking Greek. Greek was being spoken everywhere. The Hebrew scriptures had been translated into Greek about 250 years before Jesus was born. Why? Because so many Jewish people living in Egypt and around Alexandria and all over the known world who weren't in Judea spoke Greek. And I don't think it's beyond not just the possibility, I think it's highly likely that Jesus and the disciples at least spoke a basic level of Greek. Now, 𝙎𝙪𝙗𝙗 says things like, how could these uneducated fishermen have ever learned Greek? Well, I got to tell you, if you were living in a world where everybody, for the most part, spoke some amount of Greek, it would be a lot easier to learn it than it would be to learn it today, where I don't know very many people who speak Greek. I think I know one person who speaks Greek because she's a friend of mine who's from Greece. But Greek is not the lingua franca of the world today. I would say if there's any language that is, it's English. That's why everywhere I've traveled in the world, whether it's India, Nepal, whether it's different parts of Europe, I usually find people pretty easily who speak English. Back then, it would have maybe been even easier for people to find someone who spoke Greek. 𝙎𝙪𝙗𝙗 says that the disciples never could have learned Greek, and yet he managed to learn Greek and become a Greek scholar living in a world where nobody speaks Greek. Interesting. The idea that the disciples were uneducated is also, I believe, sorely mistaken and really misses the mark. There are entire bodies of research dedicated to what Judea was like during the time that Jesus Christ was growing up and living there. There's a massive 2-volume work by a 19th century scholar named Alfred Edersheim called The Life and Times of Jesus the Messiah. And I also linked that in the show notes below. It's another great resource. And he goes into great detail about how Jewish children were educated in Judea in the 1st century. There were synagogues everywhere. Read the New Testament. Everywhere Jesus goes, he's running into these different synagogues. Well, what goes on at synagogues? They don't just exist so that they can have a Shabbat service every Saturday. Children went to their local synagogues to learn the Tanakh, or to learn scripture and to memorize Torah from the time they were young all the way up until they were able to join their family and work. And students who had ability and who really showed that they could memorize a lot of scripture stayed longer. There's some people that think that Jesus was in school all the way up past his 12th birthday and even further into that, and he didn't start joining his stepfather as a carpenter until he was maybe in his late teens or as an early adult. We don't know the specifics, but we do know this. There were synagogues everywhere, and Jewish children were taught the scriptures. And the Jewish people refer to their Bible, the Old Testament, as the Tanakh. And Jewish children, it was their job growing up, before they were able to work with their parents, to memorize the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, especially young Jewish boys. And guess what else we know from this time? Jewish people living in Judea were as likely to read their Bibles in Greek as they were to read them in Hebrew. People like Jesus and the disciples, whose families, whose ancestors had been deported to Babylon and then returned with the exiles to Judea during the time in Jewish history that we read about when we read books like Ezra and Nehemiah, were speaking Aramaic, which is basically a Babylonian version of ancient Hebrew. So they didn't speak Hebrew on a regular basis, although I'm sure they read it and understood it. It was similar in some ways to Aramaic, but Jesus and the disciples spoke Aramaic. And Greek was the lingua franca of the known world. And their Bibles, in many instances, I believe they were reading from the Greek translation of the Old Testament in Greek. Jesus is seen in the Gospels quoting from the Greek Septuagint almost as much as he quotes from the Hebrew Bible. Now, some people say that's because of the way the gospel writers wrote Jesus's words. It's not that he would have been quoting from the Greek Septuagint. He would have been quoting from the Hebrew. I don't agree with that. I believe that when the New Testament writers quote Jesus as saying, "Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice." He's quoting from Hosea 6:6 in his response to some Pharisees who were asking him why he was eating with sinners. And in that instance, and in many others, we know for certain he was quoting from the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And I don't think that it's just because Matthew and John wrote down the Greek verse that Jesus said. I think they wrote down what Jesus actually said. I'm getting a little technical here, but I'm trying to prove a point with everything I understand about biblical history and the context of the New Testament and the world of Jesus Christ, that Jesus spoke Greek. And I believe the disciples spoke Greek. And it's not beyond the realm of possibility at all that as Peter spent years of his life later on in life in places like Antioch and Rome, that his Greek would have gotten a lot better. Think of it this way. If people say that Jesus didn't speak Greek, what language was he speaking when he was having a conversation with Pontius Pilate, who was a Roman governor stationed in Judea? Now, Pilate very likely would have spoken Latin because that was the language of Roman elites. But common Roman people did not speak Latin. They spoke Greek. I guarantee you Pilate did not speak Aramaic. That would have been laughable to even suggest that he speak in the language of the peasants who were from northern Israel, areas like Galilee. And Jesus did not speak Latin. I'm almost certain of that as well. So what language were they speaking? They were speaking Greek. When Jesus said, "You know what? You've said I'm a king, but my kingdom's not of this world." And Pilate asked him the most important question that Pilate probably ever asked anybody. What is truth? Only he didn't wait for Jesus to answer the question. He was staring at the truth. He was asking, what is truth? And he didn't wait for an answer. He had too much business to attend to. Thanks for watching. My name's Blake, and over the past 20 years, I've been a missionary, a pastor, and a Bible college and seminary professor. During that entire time, I've been teaching the Bible. And if you want more Bible content to come your way, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and like this video. And also, check out this video right here.